Hi and welcome to the History Hut. I'm Jim, this is Dr. K, and today we're talking Canada at war.
Da, 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 da.
Not a current war, a past war.
That's right.
Don't be alarmed.
And we won, so it's okay. Yeah,
so,
like, you know, we were on the winning side, so don't panic
really,
or anything.
It's really not a big deal.
Yeah,
but
it's history, though.
Well, yeah.
It's history.
So it's a big deal in some respects, we'll say.
That's right.
So what can you tell me about Borden, the PM who took us to war and introduced conscription?
Oh yes, what a man, eh? Well, he's a Nova Scotian guy. He was Prime Minister from 1911 to 1920. And so he's Prime Minister during the war years. He'd become the Conservative leader in 1901, and of course he's famous for being the Prime Minister that actually introduces conscription during wartime, and that's always a difficult moment, I'm sure, in everyone's lives. He also, to his credit, speaking for women everywhere, he also made sure that women got the vote, but in fact didn't give women the vote for all the reasons that they've been asking for it. You know, that they were the kind of moral compass of the country, but he believed that if he gave women who were related to anyone who was fighting on the Western Front, and then also introduced conscription, or promised to bring conscription in, that they would vote in favour of conscription because their sons, husbands, uncles, whatevers would be coming home and other people would go off to take their place. But then women get to keep the vote after the war, so it's okay. So it's good that way. But he's also the Prime Minister that at the same time as he was giving the vote to women, took the vote away from those so-called enemy aliens that we discussed, all the people that were watched during the war or in fact were interned. So they lose the vote and women gain the vote. So he's a kind of an interesting guy. He's kind of pushed into leadership, and according to what I've read, he kept saying that if anybody else wanted the job, just to let him know, because he wasn't really interested in being the leader, you know, not incredibly inspirational as a speaker. But he had in 1911 helped defeat the Liberal reciprocity deal in the House, made a kind of deal with the Toronto manufacturers to try and stop it. He's not very well trusted by the Quebec wing of his party because, of course, he is also the Prime Minister that offers money to the British to pay for their dreadnoughts, which we've discussed in another episode. So, but you know, once war is declared, he is, of course, Canada's automatically in. He's, of course, a keen supporter of Britain. One of the mistakes he makes, I suppose, and it's hard to say that it's a mistake because he wouldn't really have known, but Sam Hughes was the Minister of Militia, and I put a lot of faith in Sam Hughes, and as we'll see, Sam Hughes perhaps wasn't worthy of that faith. He's the man that gives us the Ross rifle, and even when it's clear that the Ross rifle jams in the mud and the rain, kind of insists on keeping it. So he put Sam Hughes in charge of the war effort, and he, as you've mentioned, he's also the man that brings in conscription, and does it for all the right reasons. He visits the Western Front, sees the terrible conditions that Canadian soldiers are fighting through, and immediately ups the pledge. So instead of saying to the British, we'll definitely provide you with, you know, at least 250,000 men, he's like, we'll double that, and we'll try and get 500,000 men in the field. But of course, by that time, lots of men had heard what it was like on the Western Front and weren't quite as keen and enthusiastic about going over, and so that's why conscription has to be introduced. And he does it in the same kind of way that the British do. He forms a union government, so it's called the Unionist government. So he asks the Liberals, the Liberal leader, of course still Wilfrid Laurier, asks them if he'll join with them, and they'll have just a united government. They'll bring this thing in, and then hopefully neither one of the parties will suffer after the war, right? Where people go, you brought in conscription, that's it, you know, it's all over. But of course Laurier says no, but lots of Liberals do in fact join the Union government. So, you know, he could have remained in power, I suppose, after the war, if it hadn't been for some other things as well. But it leads to, because he asked Laurier to come along with him, Laurier says no. It leads to the nastiest probably kind of typical of some modern political campaigns. Really nasty propaganda campaign against Wilfrid Laurier, and calling him a traitor. And as we'll see later on, there's lots and lots of propaganda posters like a vote for Laurier is a vote for Kaiser Wilhelm. If you vote for Laurier and the Liberals, then the Germans will win this war. So it gets really, really not nice at all. After the war, his health actually fails, and he's quite tired by that time. And he went to Versailles for the peace talks and managed to get Canada a seat on the League of Nations. But in Canada, after the war, he faces a couple of problems. One of the biggest ones, of course, is the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, and there are strikes all across the country in support of this. I think there's something like 400 strikes across the country, kind of like Air Canada this week. So he faces the General Strike of 1919, and then he also faces some new breakaway political parties, and also a revived Liberal Party, because Laurier dies and he's replaced by Mackenzie King, so a revived Liberal Party, and he picks his own replacement, Arthur Mahan, the Minister of Interior, as his own replacement. So I mean, he does some really good stuff during the war, and certainly increases our commitment to the Allies, and no doubt that helped the Allied side win the war, but he never really wanted to be the leader in the first place, and he's out of the country too much at the peace table afterwards, so again, we have really, I always wonder if he's related to Borden's hot chocolate. I don't know, I've never looked it up, but that would make me happy if he was the hot chocolate.
Hard-hitting stuff there.
I know.
From Dr. K.
Oh, well, yeah, and you're an investigative
exam?
journalist. You could probably look into that. It's like Robert Stanfield and Stanfield's underwear. Is it Robert Borden and Borden's hot chocolate? I don't know, but these are the deep and probing
I won't sleep
questions.
at that until I find out.
I know, I keep thinking that.
Speaking of questions, how many men does Canada end up mobilizing?
Oh, that's of course a very good question. It starts off quite briskly. I mean, but the amazing thing is that Canada had never really mobilized any kind of number like this before, obviously, because we're a peace-loving people. Yeah. And in the Northwest Rebellion, maybe up to 10,000 men, all volunteers. During the Boer War, between 7,000 and 8,000, and then during the Great War, an increase during the Great War, more than 600,000 men. It's like woo, and of that, there's quite a few women as well. So I think it's only fair to say the exact number, or as close as it you can get. 619,636 people serving. Of those, about 425,000 saw overseas service, including 4,518 women, lots of women over as nurses, of course. And at the end of the war, 66,573 dead. So it's over 600,000 mobilised, 66,573 dead. And if you look at wounded and casualties of war, and people that would have like lung problems from the poison gas attacks and stuff for a long, long time, I think the number of wounded comes close to 138,000. So 138,000. So really, really quite amazing, considering our population is just over 7 million. And I think we mentioned this before when we talked about immigration, that people who were recent immigrants, especially to the West, still had that really close tie to their motherlands, whether it was French settlers or Belgian settlers in the West, or the majority English-speaking settlers. They're the ones that are the keenest to kind of go back and help fight, because they still have family on the other side of the water. There's about 8,000 men would be in the Royal Canadian Navy, and their job, of course, was to keep the Atlantic approaches open. And Newfoundland is really important in this because it's our rock. It's not Alcatraz, but it's our rock. And so their job was to, of course, during the war, the Allies set up convoy systems, because the German U-boats were quite destructive. 24,000 men were in the British Air Service. That would be the Billy Bishops and other, kind of heroes of World War I. So 24,000 of those. And, you know, Canadians have a great reputation. They played their part with incredible relish, just the same as probably the Australians and the Kiwis did as well. They're in some of the worst battles, not because the British are evil and send them into the worst things, but because they're there, the British are there, the French are there, everybody has to be used, and so they're actually at some of the worst of the assaults, like the battles at Ypres, which the British call Wipers. So Ypres, and of course before that Gallipoli, after that the Somme, and Vimy Ridge, of course, really important in Canadian history. Everybody knows about Vimy Ridge, and Passchendaele. So they're there and active in all of those major engagements, as are you know, French colonial troops as well. And there's some really good books about you know, fictional accounts of World War I that have to do with Canadians, and of course probably the most well known is Timothy Finley's little book called The Wars, which looks at a boy from Ontario going off to fight in the war. And then there's Pat Barker, who has a trilogy, and one of the books is called The Ghost Road, and the other is The Regenerators, and very interesting. You know, what they had to try and get, if they were worried about a breakdown in morale of the soldiers if the officers got shell shock or refused to go over the top or just had a kind of mental breakdown. And so that book's all about the officers that are sent back to Britain to convalesce, and all the new psychiatric techniques and electric shock therapy that they used on them to try and get them fit enough to send them back in, and then, you know, keep their men going over the top. So very interesting. And then of course Joseph Boyden's fabulous book that just came out a few years ago called The 3-Day Road, and then the follow-up is Through Black Spruce. But 3-Day Road's about two Cree guys who go off to fight in the war. Absolutely wonderful, just a page turner. So it is. So yes, yes. Well, all the ones I look at are. I suppose that, you know, and that's why even on your iPad they still make you flick your fingers so that you're still page turning, right? That's what it is. So 619,000 people signed up, mostly of course men, to go off and fight the foreign foe. So absolutely amazing, really. And I may have mentioned before as well that if you take out, there's always a bit of a fuss about, oh, how much French-Canadian participation was there in the war, and with the understanding being that there wasn't a lot, and so that causes some tension in the country. But if I think it was Serge Bernier in one of his studies, he looked at the numbers and he said that, or no, maybe it's Serge Derflinger, I think maybe, if you took out all of the recent immigrants and you looked at just people that had been Canadian, you know, been here for a couple of generations, that the numbers of people that volunteered from Quebec and from outside of Quebec were roughly equal. So it's not as bad as people have kind of made out.
So what happened once reports started to come back from the front?
Well, of course, at first everybody is incredibly excited about the outbreak of war, and if you look at any account, Stefan Zweig's account of the Austrians, you know, everybody all quiet the Western Front for the Germans. You know, school teachers going, "What are you doing in class? Get out there and sign up. You know, go off and fight." And so I think there's a lot of excitement in general in Britain, and also in the colonies, you know, from these recent immigrants too. Maybe because they'd ended up in Edmonton or something. They're like, "Oh, is this all there is? I think I'll go off and fight." I don't know. But you know, at the beginning, you had men flocking to the recruitment centres, not just out of patriotism, but looking for a bit of excitement, as boys do, and also because Canada was in a recession and it was pretty bad. There were lots of cutbacks in public works and really big layoffs amongst the railway companies, and the farmers out west were dealing with some serious drought problems. And there was even a scheme at one point to send a huge number of men over to work in England in the mines, maybe in Wales in the mines as well, because there was so much unemployment. So you know, people sign up because, well, it's a steady job as long as you'll get killed, I suppose. And of course, because if you I mean, I love it's not that I love war, but I really am very fond of World War I. And if you look at all this, I know it's crazy. If you look at all the stuff surrounding it, The Economist said, you know, can't possibly have a war that lasts longer than 3 months, and you get that whole it'll all be over by Christmas, and people were really worried, you know, young guys really worried that this was like the most exciting thing that had ever happened, and they weren't going to be part of it because they didn't sign up really fast. It was going to be all over, and it's not even so much, you know, later on when the recruitment drops off, then people start to say kind of, oh well, what did you do in the war? You know, somebody will ask you that, and you'll be like, oh, I was a shirker, I stayed at home, or I was a pacifist, I didn't go. But at the very beginning, I think it was just the sheer excitement of going over, and I mean, you're going to Brittany, you're going to France, and it'll be, you know, you'll have a nice uniform, and there'll be French chicks, and you'll have a gun, and the possibility of contracting venereal disease, which probably wasn't at the top of anyone's
mind.
Not.
You know,
probably not. But
maybe aspects of it.
Certainly what would happen later on. So the recruitment at first is really, really good. By June of 1915, the Canadian Expeditionary Force had 100,000 men, and by the end of the year, they had 200,000 signed up. So people are like, wow, this is great. And as I said before, you know, great enthusiasm everywhere you went. Great enthusiasm for signing up. So it's not until these reports come back later in 1915 that there's a bit of a problem. And I think the wonderful thing is that you see kind of civic participation. So they set up model trenches in major cities, and the same in Britain. There's a place called Kew Gardens, K-E-W, Kew Gardens in London. They set up model trenches there. So they dug trenches, put the sandbags in, all lovely and neat. The king came out, you know, at the weekend, and people would come out and they would have tea, and they'd be like, oh, those are lovely, is that what my boy will be? And they're like, yes, that's what your boy will be. That's just great. And so they did the same in Canada, in all the major cities. And just for example, because the capital of Alberta is Edmonton. In case you didn't know that, just a little product placement there for Alberta. That trenches were set up in the infield of the racetrack, and the racetrack, of course, is still there, and they have Klondike Days or K Days or Capital X or whatever they call it now. And so it's the same thing. You know, parents would come out at the weekend, they'd look around, they'd be like, "Oh, what a lovely trench that is! My boy will be great in that. I'm not worried about that at all." So they had these model trenches all over the place. People could come and look, you know, and people were like, "Wow, that looks fair enough." So, you know, that kind of enthusiasm and of course lots of excitement, as I said, about the prospect of going off to war. And the last real European war had been the Napoleonic Wars, and of course they're not thinking of all the dead people, like the you know, almost 500,000 dead Frenchmen that Napoleon leaves behind in Russia. People are thinking about all the great portraits of, you know, Napoleon on his white horse crossing the Austrian Alps, and the great uniforms, and they're like, yeah, you know, those European wars, they're pretty cool, I love them. And so it's that, they don't think about the Boer War, which they probably should have, and they don't think about the Crimean War from the 1850s, which is really nasty as well. They just think about the Napoleonic period, and they're like, yeah, man, it'll be so sweet. So you have all these young guys thinking, well, you know, go off to war, it's going to be really bold and dashing and lots of fun. And you're with your friends as well. You know, a lot of people would sign up with their pals, and so you're all go off together. But by 1916, once the first campaigns at Ypres were over, and once you get to the Somme, nobody really thinks it's going to be fun when they go over anymore, and people are like, do I really want to go? I'll have to think about that. And you know, in Britain, the women's movement doesn't help at all, because and you see this in a couple of Allied places, but young men who were perfectly fit but hadn't signed up yet would receive white feathers through the mail. That means you're a coward, in case you don't know. I don't know if you've ever had one of those.
No, never.
No, because there hasn't been a war while you've been alive. And
Try
that's because people from my generation have kept this world peaceful, man. I don't think.
Easy, hippie.
Yeah.
Well, I think that about wraps up.
That should wrap that up, yeah.
This part of the discussion.
Okay.
Canada at war continues
yes.
next.
Da, 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 da.